tarda. Moltíssimes gràcies.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you so much for joining us in this debate on Ukraine, when unfortunately we're into the 5th year of the war for a few days now. The event will be in Spanish and English, in case anyone needs interpretation.
For being here. We have with us Oleksandra Matviichuk. Thank you very much for being here. And then también tenemos a Héctor Abad.
We also have with us Héctor Abad. Thank you very much for joining us.
Of the Center for Civil Liberties. She's a lawyer, an activist, having worked for a long time on the reporting of war crimes in Ukraine. For that same reason, she and her institution, the Center for Civil Liberties, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022 on recognition of that work. Héctor Abad es un escritor, ensayista.
Héctor Abad is a writer, essayist, novelist, columnist. He is the author of a very well-known book, El olvido que seremos, and recently Ahora y en la hora, a book published based on his experience in Ukraine. And the reason why we're here today is to talk not only about an important matter for international affairs, such as the Ukraine war, which unfortunately is not always receiving the attention it deserves, because there are many other issues internationally that concern us, Iran in the past few days, but we believe it is still important to talk about it. And we do so on the occasion of a meeting that we organized yesterday with the support of the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Madrid on building common understanding, building this shared understanding between Ukraine and Latin America. And we grouped together about 20 thinkers, academics, prestigious thinkers from Latin America, from different countries, from Ukraine, to exchange viewpoints on the perception from Latin America on the war in Ukraine, and to bring positions closer. We did it behind closed doors yesterday, a very rich dialogue, very interesting, and we will treat some of the topics that came up yesterday here as well. But before I get into that, and before I pass the floor over to you also, so that you can ask questions and show your concern and interest.
Basic question to Oleksandra, who is living there and suffering the reality on the ground on a daily basis, to tell us a bit about the situation right now in Ukraine. Why should we still be concerned about what's happening in the middle of a still ongoing war? So, Oleksandra, thank you very much for being here, and I will give you the floor first.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. It's an honor for me to address to this distinguished audience. I'm very grateful for organizer for such an excellent opportunity. I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm documenting war crimes in this war which Russia has launched against Ukraine for 12 years. And while this war turns people into the numbers, what we are literally doing, we are returning people their names, because people are not numbers, and life of each person matters. It was the fourth winter of large-scale invasion, and it was very difficult. Russians are deliberately destroying the energy infrastructure, the very infrastructure that civilians depend on their survival. The temperature in January, in February, in Ukraine dropped up to minus 25 degrees Celsius. Ukrainian cities were literally freezing. millions of people have restricted or no access to heating, to water, to electricity. It's a survival issue because you can't find the proper answer to a very practical question, how to warm milk for your newborn baby. And that is why International Criminal Court started the criminal case against Russia and called this action as a crimes against humanity. I remember how when first time Russians strike energy grid, the photo appeared online of an ordinary school teacher in Kiev. This woman was wearing a red winter jacket and warm hat, and she was standing tiptoe near a metal pole where she placed her computer right outside near a shop where there was a generator, and the generator was running, and that is why she can get access to internet. And right here, in a freezing cold, standing tiptoe, this Kiev school teacher was given a lecture to her students. And I remember when I looked to this photo, I told to myself, Russians come to take everything from us. Our land, our freedom, our future, the education of our children. And this ordinary Kiev school teacher decided to give them nothing. And something as simple as teaching lesson to the students became an act of resistance. So you ask me what the situation is in Ukraine. It's tough. It's not easy to live during the large-scale war, frankly speaking, because the war destroyed everything which we call normal life, like simple things as a possibility to meet your friend with cafe, to have family dinners, to hug your beloved ones. Everything disappeared, everything crushed. But these dramatic times provide people in Ukraine a possibility to express the best in us, to be courageous, to fight for freedom, to make a difficult but right choices, and to help each other. Because only when we help in each other, when people risking their lives for others whom they never met before, only in that moment we are acutely aware what does it mean to be human.
Oleksandra, me gustaría complementar.
Oleksandra, I would like to complement this perspective from Ukraine with Hector. 2023, while you were having coffee in Kramatorsk, in a city in the Donbass region, which is one of the regions under occupation after the Russian invasion, with the Ukrainian writer Victoria Melina, a missile hit the restaurant you were at, and as a consequence of that, Victoria Melina died as a consequence of the injuries caused by this missile, and Hector himself was injured as well. So I would like for you, Hector, to tell us your experience in Ukraine. Tell us about your experience in Ukraine. Good evening. Thank you for inviting me. It is an honor to be side by side with Oleksandra Matviichuk. And I met Oleksandra the very day and at the time when I met Victoria Melina. And this was at 24th June 2023 at 6 p.m. And it is not that I have a very good memory, but since now when you take pictures with your phone, well, you can record the date and time. So it was the first time that I saw Oleksandra Matviichuk, whom I admired way before because of her work on human rights law. And I did not know Victoria, a colleague writer. It was the first time I was seeing her, and I saw her at the book fair in Kiev, the Arsenal Fair, which took place in June 2023. And I went there because young Ukrainian editors who were under 25, Marina Marchuk and Annabel Sotelo, had decided to publish El Olvido que Seremos in Ukrainian, and this brought me happiness. And I was there to attend the book fair, and it was the first time that I met Victoria and Sergio Jaramillo, who's been a fighter for peace in Colombia, and Catalina Gomez, a war journalist who is today in Tehran. She went through Turkey at the time of the attacks on Iran a few days ago. And she had been living in Ukraine for a year at the time. And they, Sergio and Catalina, wanted for us to introduce a campaign created by Sergio Jaramillo, Aguanta Ucrania, Keep Up Ukraine, or Hold On Ukraine. It's weird. It's as if Ukrainians came to Colombia to say they want to support us in the peace process, or even weirder, like Nigerians coming to Colombia telling us, we want to support you in peace. So we were like aliens there. And however, we wanted to show our solidarity with Ukraine. I don't know if that was the last time you saw Victoria Melina, but it was the first time I saw her.
In Arsenal.
In Arsenal?
Yes.
Okay.
It was last time, and I couldn't manage to say goodbye to her, and I wrote to her in Messenger that day that I'm sorry I missed you in this book fairs, and so I sent you my virtual hugs. And when Victoria Melina died, now I always try to hug people when I met them. I try never postpone this because you never know whether or not you will see your beloved people again.
Yes, you have to say goodbye always. Bueno, pues ese.
So that very day when I met her, I was not going to go to the Donbass. I was not going to go to the front. Victoria wasn't either. I did not want to go. I was afraid. And Victoria was busy doing something else. But we went to a Georgian restaurant. And Victoria that day was particularly happy because she had lost touch with some soldiers. And she had found them again and they were not dead. And I was very happy with my translation of the book, El Olvido que Seremos, so we had a lot of white wine. And I think that helped us say, well, since Sergio and Catalina are not afraid of anything, well, Victoria wasn't afraid of anything either. But I was. I'm a fearful person. I did not want to go, but Sergio Jaramillo is an expert in negotiation, international negotiation, and he can convince anyone of anything. So he convinced me, and Victoria wanted to show us some places where horrendous Russian war crimes had taken place. And she had focused on documenting for years in a book she was writing in English and that was published posthumously with the title Looking at Women, Looking at War. So she wanted to join us. And we went on this very long trip. Catalina Gomez, war journalist, Sergio Jaramillo, peace negotiator, activist, Dima Kovalchuk, our fixer and chauffeur, driver, the one who translated and also translated the culture for us. And Victoria took us everywhere. She was our guide. She introduced us to a friend of hers, Oleksandra, who in Kharkiv picked up animals that were wandering around with no owner because after the bombings, the dogs, the cats, all of the animals fled. The owners could not go back to their destroyed homes. And she had a dog that she loved. And she also had a child, 11 years old, whom she loved very much. And they had taken a writer as well, Volodymyr Vakulenko, had an autistic child. The Russian had taken him in the first phase of the invasion. They had taken him twice. And between the first and the second time, he wrote a diary that he hid under a cherry tree, and Victoria, with her hands and with a shovel, had unearthed it. Victoria showed us the place. So we were traveling for 2 days with her, and we did not feel death breathing down our necks. She was an extraordinary woman, and she looked like Oleksandra a bit. She had these long hair, this long neck, and I showed these swans here because, in a way, I did not see it myself. My wife saw it. She has better eyes than me, and she, in a way, also looked like a swan. A swan, she seemed fragile, but she was not fragile. She believed nothing could happen to her. What is going to happen to me, she always said. Nothing will harm me. No harm will come my way. And I was like dragged by the current, like a river. The current of Victoria, Sergio, Catalina, who is so brave. And I wanted to see the horrors of war. I wanted to see destroyed hospitals, destroyed schools, the roads, the bridges, the ambulances, the tankers as well, burned to the ground. But as I said, nothing seemed so severe. And Victoria wanted to say goodbye to some friends because she had received a grant to go to Paris for a year to finish writing and polishing her book in English. And she said, during this year, these friends of mine will probably be killed, and I want to be able to say goodbye to them. I want to hug them. I want to say goodbye, what Oleksandra was not able to do. She was a woman who always had a smile, a bit of an ironic smile. She had a great sense of humor. She had abandoned literature. She wrote children's stories. She had written novels, and now she only wanted to write. She only wanted to describe and report war crimes, following the testimonials of many women. And every once in a while, she wrote poems. She said that poems were like the explosion of a grenade, and that without syntax and orthography and colons and semicolons, she could only express herself through poems. And in this book of mine, I included some of her poems, and I also included an epigraph which is taken from a novel that was translated into Spanish a bit before these facts, these events, and she showed me proudly in her phone. Look at the beautiful cover, she said. And there was a dog on the cover because this novel is narrated by a dog called Dom. And there's this sentence, this quote in this novel: stories should be saved at whatever cost. They jump from an almost dead body to a young and living body. Well, young is not true, but it's their last opportunity. And in this posthumous book, she said, if I'm ever killed, I hope that my family, my son, will understand and forgive me. She knew perfectly well the risks she was taking. But as I said, in this journey, we did not feel that death was around the corner. And I don't want to take too long talking about this. Later, or at this point, later I will tell you about what happened at a restaurant in Kramatorsk 3 days after meeting Victoria and Oleksandra. I was not a friend of Victoria. I became a friend of Victoria after her death. But exactly 3 days later, I think in Arsenal we said goodbye at 7:30 p.m. after presenting the Aguanta Ucrania campaign. And at 7:27 in the evening, 7:28, on that 27th of June, was when the missile was dropped and killed 13 people, and it injured and mutilated another 62. And for them, and especially for Victoria, I wrote this book. Thank you. Thank you, Héctor. We'll go back.
Something we discussed yesterday in our event, but you have a very strong narrative about this idea of negotiations and whether it is time to negotiate, but most importantly, and I remember our conversation yesterday, the conditions for those negotiations, what needs to be recognized in that framework. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I work with people affected by this war directly. So let me assure you, people in Ukraine dream about peace. For obvious reason, because war is horrible. War probably is the most horrible thing which just can happen in a human life. So people in Ukraine dream about peace, but simply don't want to be occupied. Because occupation, it's not peace. Occupation is the same war, just in another form. Occupation doesn't decrease human suffering. Occupation just makes human suffering invisible. And Russian occupation is not just changing one state flag to another. Russian occupation means enforced disappearances, torture, rape, denial of your identity, forcible adoption of your own children, filtration camps, and mass graves. So I know a lot about human cost of this war, and that is why I would like to draw your attention to one fact. Ironically, the Trump's year of negotiation became the deadliest year for Ukrainian civilians since the large-scale war started. UN state that the number of people, civilians, who were killed and injured in Ukraine-controlled part of territory, far from the battlefield, this number was increased in 31% in comparison with the previous year. So what's wrong with this peace process? I will tell you, they lost human dimension. Politicians discussed natural minerals, Russia's territorial claims, geopolitical interest, even Putin's vision of Ukrainian history, but they didn't discuss people, and it's not okay. We still have no idea what will be with dozens of thousands of Ukrainian children separated with their families, illegally deported to Russia, put in Russian re-education camps, told that you're not Ukrainian, you're Russian children, your families, your parents refused from you, you will be adopted by Russian families who will bring you up as Russians. We still have no idea what will be with dozens of thousands Ukrainian civilians who were legally detained, as well as prisoners of the war, men, women, children. I interviewed hundreds of people who survived Russian captivity. They told me how they were beaten, raped, locked into wooden boxes, their fingers were cut, their nails were torn away, their nails were drilled, they were electrically shocked through their genitalia. One woman told me how her eye was dragged out with a spoon. It's horrible stories. These people are literally dying in Russian prisons. Part of them have no chance to be alive till the end of these peace talks. Politicians discuss the question of occupied territories like it's empty spaces. But I'm sorry, these territories are not empty. Millions of Ukrainians live on these territories, like in gray zone. They have no tools how to defend their rights, their freedom, their property, their life, their children, their beloved ones. So this is the main problem of this negotiation, because when you lost human dimension and people are not priority, it makes Russians understand a very simple thing, that there is no red line and they can do whatever they want. And because Russia can't win on the battlefield, Russia turned terror against civilians as the main tool of this war. And that is why we had the deadliest period for Ukrainian civilians since the large-scale war started.
Thank you, Oleksandra. Héctor, precisamente.
Héctor, in your profession, the most important part you said yesterday and before is telling stories. You tell stories, Héctor, about what you've seen and what you've experienced. Tell us your story. The invasion of Ukraine was the beginning of something that we are now seeing is increasingly worse every day that passes. And it is the belief, the thought, that the strongest, just because they're stronger, are right. And, well, this is more than frequent in the history of the world, but we believed that with international law, with human rights, and with the laws that try to defend the weakest and the most unprotected, this idea would no longer be so dominant and so popular. And no. I remember very well how Putin justified his invasion by saying that Ukraine didn't exist, that Ukraine was the small Russia, that Ukrainian language was just a dialect, and it was a negligible dialect. And, well, I had just had a book translated into Ukrainian and not Russian, and he was there to denazify the country, and it was not a war. It was a special military operation, as they still call it in Russia. It's compulsory to call it that in Russia. Due to pure literary reasons and due to my appreciation of these two editors under 25 years of age, I started to show interest in Ukraine, their story, their pain. I was, for example, interested in the story of the Holodomor, which was a word I did not know, and how a writer born in Ukrainian territory, Vasily Grossman, had written and perfectly described in Galicia the horror of Holodomor, where millions and millions of people died of hunger. My job is to write. I went there to present a book, and I let myself be dragged to the front line. Nothing was supposed to happen to us. And on the last day, we were celebrating that nothing had happened to us, that we were there flirting with death, but nothing had happened to us. And I was about to clink my glass with Victoria Melina. There was a dry law. There was a curfew. We had to eat and drink quickly and leave. But I had brought her a bottle of whiskey to Sergio Jaramillo as a gift because he loves whiskey and so do I. And he said, oh, well, let's disobey the law for a bit. And I am half deaf. I have a hearing aid, and I didn't have it then. And I didn't understand what Sergio was saying. So I switched places to be able to hear him better with my good ear. So I went from the couch where we were to the other side, and Victoria took my place. Paul Auster talks about music and the dissonance. We were 5 at that table. It was 5 of us. It was like a Russian roulette. It was like there was one bullet in the barrel of a gun, and it was going to kill one of us. I cannot explain it to myself. I went to the other side. Sergio ducked to pour his whiskey. He gave me my whiskey, and I said to Victoria, they will discover us. It's so obvious. This is whiskey. And she looked at me with her smile, always ironic smile, and she said,
it looks like apple juice. And then, bah!
I felt like a volcano was erupting. I did not feel anything coming from above. Dima Kovalchuk, the fixer, as they call them in the journalistic language, as we call those who translate language and culture, he heard and saw something, and he grabbed Catalina by her back, and she made her duck under the table, and he himself got under the table. Sergio was under the table pouring whiskey in hiding, and I was cheering with Victoria. She did have apple juice, and I had whiskey in my glass. And at that time, I fell on the floor, and I thought, we were just killed. That was the last thing I thought. We were just killed. We've been killed. And I actually think they did kill us. I was never certain whether they did kill us or not. I later found a poem by a great poet, Ukrainian poet, who died in a concentration camp after being savagely tortured, Basilistus. And I found these lines. Who is he? A man, dead or alive? He may be dead and alive at the same time, alone with himself. So I stood up, said he was injured. Catalina was screaming, and Victoria was not answering. Victoria, Victoria. We called her name. She looked in one piece. There was no blood on her body. Her head was slightly hanging back. And she was there, straight up. She was a bit paler than usual, and she was not responding. And I got away from there, and Basilistus also says, look, you're born again in a new body, in a new spirit. And I felt like I was the oldest at that table, one of the oldest, or the oldest at that restaurant. And after a while, I knew that at that restaurant, these two twins died. They were 14 years old, Julia and Anna Aksenchenko. Their father had taken them there to eat a pizza to congratulate them on their good grades. And the two of them died, and their father survived. And I cannot imagine a situation worse than that in the life of a person. And after I wrote that book, one day my daughter came to my place and said, Father, I'm waiting. I'm expecting. I was not a grandfather. And I said, oh, that's so nice. She studied here in Barcelona. And I said, oh, I'm so happy that you're expecting. And she said, I'll have twins. I didn't know if it was going to be boys or girls. And I thought, oh, what is this? Julia and Anna are reincarnated. I honestly thought that. Everything was very strange. During that time, after this horror, Victoria died 3 days later, on July 1st. She never regained consciousness, and I had never married in my life. And at the age of 65, I had never married, and I decided to get married. And I remember that my mother had left me a ring as inheritance, her father's ring, whom she never met because he was killed in a car crash when she was 3. And in this ring, in this very ring, it says, you can see it.
1900.
It says Victoria, 1922, 1 century before the Russian invasion on Ukraine. Everything is so strange. And I went to Canada, to Toronto, and I spoke to Victoria's father, and I told him this story, and I apologized to him. Apologized because I was not the dead one. Not because I'm sad to be alive. I'm happy to be alive. I'm happy that I'm alive. I am happy that I was able to meet my grandchildren, whom I wouldn't have met otherwise. And I had no permission to go there. My wife told me not to go to Ukraine. She begged me not to go to Ukraine. My son said, what are you doing? Are you crazy going to Ukraine? And my son, who also studied here in Barcelona at the UPC University, he said, if I were to tell you I'm going to Ukraine and I'm going to go to Donbass for a little bit, what would you have said to me? And I said, I would have grabbed you, if possible, to stop you from going, because it is awful what Oleksandra describes. It's exactly like that. We think if we defend the Ukrainians, we're right-winged, or the Palestinians were left-wing, and if we protest for the killing of civilians in Iran or something else. But everything that is happening is appalling, is awful. And it's the imposition of these strong men who just met in Alaska and who are telling off the weak. And they do not want for words to tell what is happening. And what Oleksandra does is using those words to tell us what's happening. And that's what Victoria did as well. And I know that if the dead one would have been me or Sergio or Catalina or Dima, Victoria would have documented that war crime. And I wrote this modest book to document at least these war crime that she was not able to document herself because it was a restaurant for civilians. The Russians said on the second floor of that restaurant there was NATO offices, and I saw that restaurant with my very eyes. There was no second floor. Of course, there were military. Everywhere in Ukraine, there's military men, wherever you go, because they're at war. But the ones who died, out of the 13 who died, there was just one military man. And he was not on duty or fighting a battle. So it's just another war crime on top of the many that take place every day nowadays in Ukraine when people line up to buy bread. I mean, the world is awful. Life is beautiful, and because life is beautiful and because we like life, this is why we defend this. And that's what Oleksandra fights for. And that's what we write for, trying to remind people how beautiful life can be and how awful, how terrible it is that people who hate freedom, people who hate expression, different languages, give, and I'm sorry to take too long, I'll finish with this. We went to see a play at the theater by the husband of one of my editors. He was the director. There were 3 actors. Life at time of war, 2 male soldiers fall in love. A play that you could never present in Russia. Being a homosexual in Russia is, well, equals eating human beings. There were 3 actors. One of them, well, there's a scarcity of men, so one of them went to war and he died in his first battle, one of these 3 actors that we saw in Kyiv. But there, they were defending what we defend, what Barcelona has defended from the Franco era, that everyone should do whatever they wish to do with their private lives. And this is what we defend also in Ukraine, what they defend in Ukraine and what Oleksandra defends as well. And this is why, fortunately, her organization and her, they were granted the Nobel Peace Prize by the Norwegians. But this is not just a matter of Norwegians. This affects all of us. And it's not a right-wing or left-wing matter. It is against invasions, against invaders, and in favor of the invaded. It is in favor of the victims. This is why we talk, and this is why we're here. Yes, recognition, acknowledgement.
La importancia que tiene.
The importance not only what we're discussing now about negotiations or a territory or not, and what are those terms, but recognizing who was the invader and who was invaded. It's very different, yes. And in that recognition, Oleksandra yesterday told us that this is the foundation for any possible future reconciliation. But a reconciliation without recognition is impossible. And precisely Oleksandra, in all of the work that she does at the Center for Civil Liberties, has made recognition through documentation of war crimes her contribution to this future situation of, let's say, more justice, if we can ever reach that scenario. But I would like for Oleksandra.
But I would like you to explain us about the importance of recognition.
All this hell which we face in Ukraine is a result of total impunity which Russia enjoyed for decades. Russian troops committed horrible crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Libya, in Syria, in other countries of the world. They have never been punished. They believe they can do whatever they want. We must break this circle of impunity. We must demonstrate justice, not just for people in Ukraine, not just for people who suffered from Russian war crimes in other countries, but in order to prevent a next Russian attack to the next nation. Our Russian human rights colleagues from Memorial, they analyzed Russian tactics in Chechnya, in Syria, and Ukraine, and they told this is the same war crime playbook, the chain of wars, chain of crimes, and chain of impunity. And Putin started large-scale war, not because he wanted to occupy just one more part of Ukrainian land. Putin started large-scale war because he wanted to occupy and destroy the whole Ukraine and move further. He sees Ukraine as a bridge to Europe. His logic is historical. He dreams about his legacy. He wants to bring this war crime playbook to the next European country. And that is why people in European countries, they are safe only because Ukrainians are still resisting and don't let Russian army to move further. We are documenting war crimes, and we have in our database more than 98,000 episodes. It's a huge amount, but still just a tip of iceberg, because Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. Russia instrumentalized the pain and tried to break people's resistance and occupy the country by the tool which I call the immense pain on civilian population. So we are recording something more than just violations of Geneva and Hague Conventions. Let me illustrate it with a story. This is a story of 10-year-old boy Ilya from Mariupol. When Russians tried to siege the city, they didn't allow the International Committee of Red Cross to open green corridors and to evacuate civilians. Hence, Ilya and his mother, like other people in Mariupol, had to hide in the basement of their residential building from Russian shelling. They melted snow to have water. They made fires to cook at least some food. But when supplies ran out, they were forced to go out, and suddenly they appeared in the center of Russian shelling. Ilya's mother was hit in her head, and the boy's legs were torn. With the last strength, his mother took her son to the friend apartment. It was no medical assistance, because prior to this, Russians deliberately destroyed maternity hospital and entire medical infrastructure in Mariupol. So in this friend apartment, they just lay down on a couch and they hugged each other. They were lying like this for several hours. And this 10-year-old boy told to my colleague how his mother died and got frozen right in his arms. We are working hard to provide a chance for justice to all people affected by this war, regardless who they are, their social position, the types of crime they endured, and whether or not media or international organizations are interested in their case. Because life of every person matters. And that is why our mobile groups are going to the smallest village in my country to restore what happened with ordinary farmer in this village. And I don't want to end on the pessimist note. I know I'm not naive that there is no guarantees in our life, but our future is not just unclear, it's also not pre-written. This means that we always have a chance and responsibility to fight for future which we want for us and for our children. And let me illustrate it with the last story. Once I interviewed professor and scientist Igor Kozlovsky, who spent 700 days from Russian captivity. Before that, as I mentioned before, I interviewed hundreds of people. They told me horrible stories that it was little that could surprise me. But Professor Igor Kozlovsky mentioned a tale which was insignificant to the evidence base, but it's impressed me deeply. He described how he was kept in solitary confinement in tiny cell in basement with no window, no light, no fresh air. It was purely ventilated. It was difficult for him to breathe. Sewage flows on the dirty floor. And through the opening of the sewage, rats were crawling down. And this well-known professor in my country told me how he gave lectures on philosophy to these rats just in order to hear a sound of human voice, because he was kept in solitary confinement for months and months. And legally, Igor Kozlovsky was a victim because he was illegally abducted, detained in inhuman conditions. He was tortured so severely that he has to relearn how to walk again. But he told me that all his experience, it's not a reason for him to treat himself and to experience himself as a victim, because the foundation of our existence is dignity, not victimhood, and dignity is action. So I want to conclude. We are not hostages of the circumstances. We are participants of this historical process. And dignity gives us strength and courage to continue our fight, even in unbearable conditions.
Héctor, quisiera terminar esta...
Héctor, I would like to finish this conversation with a question, a matter that you mentioned, which is this trend to analyze everything that happens in the world through the lenses offered by the strong men, these power relations, these power struggles, as if that were the only thing that matters nowadays in international relations. And we finished yesterday's session saying that international relations based on power actually mirror the preferred scenario of these strong men, these powerful men who instrumentalize these situations. And the strength and power logics that probably escape our capacity to act and have an impact do have in words, in narratives that you use as a writer, a tool to fight. Words are your raw material. How can these words contribute to getting us out of this scenario, which is based on strength and power alone? I think that anyone that studies Ukrainian history for a bit, for the last century, 1.5 centuries, anyone who studies Ukraine from the moment of their independence, 1990, 1991, their struggle to defend a way of being, their desire to look like something and to distance themselves from the tyranny of Russia and their government model and absolute disavowing of the principles and values that we defend. I think that anyone who studies this would see that the offense is very clear. The horror is very clear. The guilt. From what little I knew from Ukraine and the Ukrainians, I think that they, and the female they in particular, have this courage, this resistance, this resilience, this inconceivable and so difficult to understand capacity to resist strength with something that seems weak. But in the case of Victoria and in the case of Oleksandra as well, is the strength of narrating, of telling the truth, making it known, exposing themselves the way they do, using words. And of course, they also defend themselves with weapons. They have to. But it's very difficult to defend oneself than attacking. Being invaded is completely different from invading. We can never forget that. And they need weapons. In justice, one professor once said, there's this set of scales, but also a sword. And the Ukrainians need this sword to defend themselves and shields to defend themselves. Because otherwise, this blitzkrieg that Putin was planning, if they had not been able to defend themselves with the courage, the ingenuity, and their capacity, well, they would have implemented their own government. Russia would have implemented their government, and they would have managed what Victoria feared, the annihilation of an entire generation of musicians, professors, intellectuals, writers, scientists, and regular people who try to build a different society. I do not know if literature, words, telling stories, I don't know if this will help save us from the horror and the world we're living in, where the worst, the basest human instincts have resurfaced, as if history were turning backwards, like in the 30s of the last century, where the strong men and the fascists are again seducing so many people in so many countries. And I don't know if literature can oppose that, but the writers whom I love the most, some of them Ukrainians, some of them Ukrainians, not in the sense of the language, but who were born there, such as the one I mentioned, Vasily Grossman, Joseph Roth, Stus, they oppose this fragile tool of the words and truth against strength. And I believe the world would have ended a long time ago if it were not for these poets, these writers who at least pose this resistance. I want to believe that, because otherwise I would go mute and I would never write again. I want to believe this is good for something. This helps in a way. I want to believe that Victoria's sacrifice is not in vain, and that her books remain, and that her son, who was 11, will forgive her and respect her for the rest of his life, and that what we say about her and that the survival of her books will help to stop this plan of Putin to annihilate an entire generation that fights for the things we believe in. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, of language, religion or non-religion. The things that we consider normal and that Europe represents and that Ukraine wants, because Ukraine is simply punished because there were two models, the one of the EU that so many disdain now and that of the Russian Federation. And interestingly, the Ukrainians prefer the model of the EU rather than the Russian Federation. I don't know why. They should ask the Hungarians. Let them have a plebiscite. If they like it so much, they should choose the Russian model. Wonderful. I don't know. I think if Colombians, as far as we are in the far west, well, I think we would vote to be more similar to you rather than these people who caress your face with venom and kill you just because you think differently to what the new czar thinks and orders you to think like. So, yeah, it pleases me greatly to be here defending these words side by side with someone who defends them with more courage than myself. I am in peaceful Colombia, let's say like that, but Oleksandra tomorrow is going back to the cold, without heating, without power, the cold of a country martyred by a barbarian, which is punishing the Russians as well. There are more Russian deaths than Ukrainian deaths, but they cannot demonstrate there. The mothers and the fathers of Russian soldiers cannot go out on the streets to protest. They cannot even do that. Thank you so much. I think it's been an unforgettable conversation. And I wouldn't want to close before passing the floor over to our Chairman, Josep Borrell, and giving the opportunity to the audience as well to speak to any of these matters or contribute if there's something you would like to say. I'm sure you're all as moved and touched as I am. It's difficult now. It is now, today is more difficult than ever to speak here. Carmen.
I think that you noticed that there was a huge silence in the room. I would like to know from you, what do you think that the EU has still not done and should be doing in order to give you the opportunity of arriving someday at some point to the table of negotiation in much better conditions than you are right now?
Thank you very much for this question. Let me return to 2022. The February when the large-scale war started, I refused to evacuate, and with a part of my team, we continued our work on the ground. It was a very difficult time. We have no idea what will be tomorrow, and that is why we greet it every morning as a victory, because we managed to stand just for one more night. It was a time when Russian troops tried to circle my city, and not just Putin, all international partners were confident that Ukraine has no potential to resist to such enormous military threat. And I remember how international organizations evacuated their personnel, even international humanitarian organizations. They left us alone. But ordinary people remained. And ordinary people started to do extraordinary things. It were ordinary people who helped to survive under artillery's fire. It were ordinary people who took people out from the ruined cities. It were ordinary people who broke through the encirclement to provide humanitarian aid. And suddenly, it became obvious that we have a chance to resist, that ordinary people who fighting for their freedom and human dignity are stronger than even the second army in the world. And our partners, like European Union, told that time, let's help Ukraine not to fail. And Ukraine started to receive first weapons to be able to defend ourselves. And first real sanctions were introduced into force. And we are extremely grateful because this helped us to survive. You literally saved us that moment. But this also an explanation why Ukrainians was waiting for a first modern tank for more than a year. Why Ukrainians was waiting for first modern plane for more than 3 years. Why we're still waiting for creation of special tribunal on aggression, for confiscation of Russian frozen assets, for arrest of Russian shadow fleet, the boats who bypass the sanctions and feed this war, because while Russia can sell oil and gas, they have money to pay soldiers, and so on and so forth. And I will tell you why. Because there is a huge difference between let's help Ukraine not to fail and let's help Ukraine to win the peace. A huge difference. And we can practically measure this difference in types of weapons, in gravity of sanctions, in speed of decisions. And yes, European Union has done a great job. The speed of decisions was unprecedented for European countries. But let's be honest, at the end, the history will judge us not how we try. The history will judge us whether or not we get result. This will be the final judgment. And I want you to know that time for people in European countries and in Ukraine is going differently. We are dying. We are dying. The time for us converted in numerous deaths in battlefield, in numerous deaths in deep rear, in numerous deaths in occupied territories. So while we are grateful for all assistance and support we get, let's be direct. While this bloody war is still going on, all of us must do more. Let me tell you something very important. There is no magic button how to stop this war. But there is a very clear goal. We have to make the price for war for Putin much higher than price for peace. Because war is profitable for Putin. War provides for him excuse for all internal problems. War centralized his power. War is profitable for Russians. Let me explain on historical example. When Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, Soviet families started to receive coffins. It resulted in negative resonance in Soviet society, and Soviet withdrew from Afghanistan. Russians learned this lesson. Now, when Russian families received coffins from Ukraine, they received money, enormous amount of money. And Russia pretends to be great, and majority of people know just Moscow and St. Petersburg, but Russia is very poor. Majority of people in Russia live in unbelievable poverty in depressive regions. For these people, the only existing social lift is Russian army. Because when they joined Russian army, they started to receive money which they can't even dream in their depressive region. Even more, our Russian friends and human rights colleagues told me that when this person will be killed in the war in Ukraine, his family received money which that concrete person wouldn't never earn, even if he would work till the end of his life. Can you imagine the situation? And that is why our Russian friends and human rights colleagues call this type of economy necronomy. They sell death. And we must crush this economy. And that's why when I look to every package of sanctions, I always have the same feeling. Oh my God, so it means that before this day, all this for years, it was legitimate to buy and to sell? So why we use this drop-to-drop policy? Why we just not use everything tool which we can to stop this ability of Russian economy to feed this bloody war? There are a lot of questions with such ground, and I'm not the smartest person in the room. I'm not economist, I'm human rights lawyer, but I do believe that this dramatic time, they test us. They test all of us for true courage, for true leadership, and for true responsibility.
Thank you very much. No, andaban.
Bueno, yo creía que pensaba.
I thought there would be more questions from the audience. Are there really no more questions? Last chance. Okay. So, what can I add What can I add to this conversation? What can I add that you have not said already? Héctor, your direct experience, well, I understand it's very shocking seeing someone die. And this direct experience is one amongst hundreds of thousands of people who have died. And the experience that our dear colleague, our friend, Nobel Prize brings to us is more broad, more general. The experience of a people that struggles to maintain their freedom. And something which is not entirely understood in European society and even less in Latin American society, as we've been discussing in Madrid for the past few days. There are many political leaders in Latin America who believe that this is a war between large powers and that, in a way, Ukrainians are the infantry of American imperialism, which is butting heads with Russian imperialism. And it's not their war, and it should have never happened. And there's a whole position. There are people who say they are left-wing, who consider that Ukrainians are paying the price for a collision of empires, and that the American empire holds part of the responsibility because they expanded NATO beyond their promises, and that, in a way, they justify, maybe not morally, but at least politically, they justify Putin's response. And this is why I believe these sort of meetings are so important. We're not just here to remember our dead friend or to recount the personal experience of some, but to extract the essence of this conflict. Why has this conflict taken place? Who is responsible? Ukrainians are still struggling, are still fighting. So what fuels them? What keeps them at it? Because they've been at war for 4 years. This war has lasted longer than the war of Germany against Russia in the Second World War. The Great Patriotic War did not last 4 years, and this one has lasted 4 years, and we do not know how many more will come. Ukrainians fight because at some point in their history, they decided, as our guest said, they decided that they preferred to belong to a group of countries where political freedoms were acknowledged, recognized, rather than being in the orbit of Putin Russia, which was a reincarnation of the old authoritarian empires, Bolshevik or Tsarist. And that choice, they are paying a dear price for it, because this choice during the Maidan events, when the Ukrainian pro-Russian president fled, well, immediately after the Crimea invasion came. The invasion of Crimea is the response to Ukraine's decision to be placed, as a Russian leader would say, in the European orbit. They are paying a dear price for that decision. They are still paying for it. And as she said, the problem is not just the capacity to resist that they have, but our willingness to help them, because without help of the Western world, Ukraine cannot resist. And until now, this help at first was given by the Americans, then by Europeans. They stopped the Russian invasion on their own. Our weapons came late. Yes, we armed them, but when the weapons arrived, the war had been ongoing for a few months already, and they did not wait for the weapons to arrive to stop the Russians. They stopped the Russians, and they continued to stop them because they were armed by us. And now the U.S., Trump's U.S., is no longer sending weapons, giving weapons to Ukraine in the sense of not charging for them. Trump's America is selling the weapons to us, Europeans, and we give them to Ukraine. But after a payment, giving is not the same as selling. So they sell them to us. and they still maintain the irreplaceable help of the intelligence services based on satellite information, satellite images, as we've been discussing in Madrid over the past few days. Without that, it would be very difficult for Ukraine to uphold the level of technification of this modern warfare. Russia is trying to destroy the electricity system of Ukraine, and Ukraine is trying to destroy the oil refining system of Russia. Each knows what is the other's Achilles heel, but for that they need modern weapons and very sophisticated guidance systems based on US satellites that Europeans do not have. If Trump decided tomorrow to suspend this help that is maintaining for now, the survival of Ukraine would be very difficult, and Europeans, well, it would be difficult for us to replace them. This is why, when we say if the war lasts a long time, a short time, there's a relevant question that needs to be answered, not by Ukrainians, but by ourselves, the ones who are giving assistance, because it's a very quick way of ending the war, which is stopping the help to Ukraine. We want the war to end. If someone says that, it would be as easy as saying suspending US aid to Ukraine, and the war would end due to surrender. But is this how we want the war to end? Trump wants a quick end, and Ukrainians want the war to end in a way that preserves what they've been fighting for. And this is the big question that is going to be posed, the big existential matter. How long is the Western world going to continue sending aid? And in the reasonable and recent critique that you offered us, what came up is that our help was too gradual, step by step. We did not give everything from the very beginning. We gave as the war prolonged itself and we saw Ukraine resisting, because at the beginning no one believed that Ukraine was able to resist. As you said, the embassies were the first ones who fled, and no one would have bet on Russia being stopped at Kyiv's doors. They thought it was going to be a couple of weeks, like Putin thought. And when we saw they resisted, we had a powerful incentive to help them. But the criticism we have to do of ourselves, and I do it myself in the first person, because in a way I was there for better or worse, and I did what I could and what I could not. The first measure was offering 5,000 effectives to Russia, to Ukraine, which was not enough, of course, but between the 5,000 helmets, but between that and the F-17s that we sent, a long time elapsed, too long, without giving them the weapons that we had and we could have given without waiting so long. Why did we wait 2 years to send the F-16s, the planes? Why didn't we not do it from the very beginning? Because we were afraid of Russia's reaction. It was as simple as that. It was fear. Every time we thought about sending the Leopard tankers, oh no, are you mad? If we give them those tankers, Russia will be mad. We ended up giving them, but with delay. Patriot missiles, oh no, no, no way. Russia will be so mad at us. And Russia will be mad, Russia will be angry and careful because they have a nuclear bomb. This is what oftentimes delayed our aid. Not when it comes to the amount of money, but the quality, the instruments that we offered. It took us a long time to send them the F-16s, and now this is no secret. Many of the F-16s that we gave them cannot act because they do not have the missiles that they have to shoot when they're flying. So keeping them in the air but not having anything to shoot makes no sense. So they are on the ground simply because they lack ammunition. And the ammunition is supplied by the US, and a lot of that ammunition is being used in the Persian Gulf. They are being massively used in another war that distracts resources. But I hope that Western societies will take on the responsibility. They will continue to help Ukraine, and they will not accept a quick peace, because it's just a way of doing away with the problem. This quick peace will not be necessarily the peace that Ukraine has fought to achieve. It should be a fair peace. And justice is measured also based on relationships of strength. And this is also measured in the form of support. And this is our historic responsibility. I could quote 1,000 different particular cases of suffering of someone in a specific place, but we need to see the whole picture. And the whole picture is that people fights for something beyond itself. You said it also. The first line of defense of Europe is Ukraine. The first line of defense is being fought by the Ukrainian army. If the war were to end tomorrow in Putin's terms, I don't think we would be too happy to have the Russian army at the Polish border. I'm sure the Polish and the Lithuanians would not be happy. No one would be happy. And the last thing I would like to say is, who is dying on the Russian side? It's not the sons of the bourgeoisie in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's the poorest people in the country. You said it. You explained it. When I was in Brussels, we had the data of current account balances in Russian banks by regions. The current account balance, the data given by the Russian Central Bank, and you saw that the current account balances of the poorest regions of Russia, ever since the war started, had taken a great leap. All of a sudden, there was a rain of money in the poorest regions that was visible in something as basic as the current account balance. The balance in the current account of the Russian citizens who lived in the poorest areas of Russia, well, someone had gone there and offered a lot of money, and that was, of course, the army, with the salaries they paid to soldiers or the pensions they paid once they died. Wars are fought with men and materials and money, and Russia gets money out of the sale of hydrocarbons, and they can sell that if someone is buying. And we've continued to buy, and we've also been very gradual in banning that. Maybe because we did not have the power that the U.S. has. The U.S. has a power. When they want someone to do something, they manage it. And if they say to someone, stop buying Russian oil or you'll see what happens, well, that someone stops buying Russian oil. So this means that we should not be afraid of power. Power is what allows you to make your wishes come true, to make what you want to happen. I would love to go, or I would have loved to go to the minister of another country and say, do not buy Russian oil. Russian oil is used to kill Ukrainian citizens. But then they would say, but I have to buy that oil because then you buy the gas oil that I distill from it. You're not buying the Russian oil directly, but you buy the gas oil that I distill out of the oil I buy from Russia. So there's a lot of self-criticism that we have to exercise. Of course, this should not speak less of our commitment. It should be something that pushes us to keep up our commitment, because there are many people behind the words of our guest today whom we thank profoundly for being here, and the CIDOB as well, for acting as a platform, because societies need to know how, because they react based on their knowledge, and this is why authoritarian regimes forbid information. They stop information, and free regimes should promote information, because based on that, citizens react. Thank you very much.
It was